viewers, welcome to another video. I'm so glad to have you. This one is going to be interesting, but it's also going to be a little bit sad and a little bit dark, so if you're not in the headspace for that right now, consider this your warning. Please heed that warning if you feel like you should. I have a really great dissertation-length video about the history and legacy of the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime that I will link above. That is a lot lighter if you still want something of mine to watch today that's like a lot less heavy than this one is. And also for friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder-length curly hair. I'm wearing a maroon t-shirt with a necklace on, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I think that's all the housekeeping, so let's get into it. The idea for this video came out of my autism and vaccines video where we talked about the history of that whole mess and also why people want to believe that narrative, and I briefly mentioned that a lot of people use that vaccination myth as a way to sell their own quack cures and make a wild amount of money off of actively harming autistic children, and I decided that it would be an interesting video in and of itself, which obviously brings us here. My primary source for this video was this 2008 book by Dr. Paul Offit titled Autism's False Prophets, Bad Science, Risky Medicine, and the Search for a Cure, that I swear just appeared on my bookshelf one day years ago, and I don't know where it came from or why it was there, but that's beside the point. I didn't buy it. Because I'm going to be basing so much of this video on this book, I do feel it's only right to give a little book review of it since I'm tacitly recommending it to you by using it as my primary source in this video. So here's a little review. The first thing, I have incredible respect for anybody who's able to take really complicated concepts such as scientific research and explain them in accessible ways that any audience can understand. A huge part of the pseudoscience conspiracy theory issue is due to the inaccessibility pitfalls of scientific communication, so he gets like 15 out of 10 points in that particular regard. He also structured this book in such a way where he would start by telling you like all the promising aspects of a cure so that you would be inclined to believe that it worked or that it was true, and then systematically breaking apart every single piece of that, which led you to, over the course of the book, literally learn critical thinking skills around shoddy science because you start looking for red flags in his utopian descriptions of the next cure, which I thought was really amazing pedagogically. He also started the book with shorter anecdotes that functioned like that, so you already knew that rhythm by the time you had to read like really long chunks of exposition about the vaccine crisis before he was able to debunk all of those pieces, which I think really held attention there because maybe it was a little bit boring, but you were on the edge of your seat anyway because you were waiting for it to all come crashing down. I also in general was very impressed by how interesting and engaging it all was. He turned it into a story rather than a sort of like textbooky style of writing. I don't mind either presentation personally, but for the target audience, parents who might fall for these so-called cures who are not scientists and whatnot, it was just absolutely perfect, and it was also only like 250 pages, which is really great. My one critique would be that like this book is very 2008. He refers to meltdowns as tantrums at one point. He says the prison of autism a couple times. It was overall very like, parenting autistic kids can be torture, so it makes sense that parents would want to make this horrible illness go away about everything, which maybe wasn't my favorite. But what I did find interesting was that this narrative sort of changed as the book progressed, particularly in the later chapters where he mentioned 2 blogs run by women who realized that they were autistic after their children were diagnosed that began to teeter more into the neurodiversity affirming side of things to a degree where like I almost wondered if the earlier, more ableism-heavy chapters were there to connect to the readership that's most likely to fall for these cures and then slowly bring them to a different view of their child, but perhaps it's a little bit too generous of a read. I also want to be super clear that just because this text is this ableist in 2008 does not mean that Dr. Offit himself still believes all of this about autistic people. I honestly probably would have agreed with much of this rhetoric about disability in 2008 as well. I mean, I was 6, so let's be real, I was reading full nonfiction books at this reading level in the 2nd grade, so that could genuinely be the case. Either way, this stuff has changed a lot, it's changed very quickly, and medicine isn't caught up, but it's working on catching up at the very least. I can attest to that, that is my day job. Overall, I would totally recommend this book. It goes a lot more in depth about some of the things that we're going to talk about more briefly today, and it's super accessible, so for people who don't know a lot about the scientific method, it's a really great way to learn about that. I think it could have talked more about certain things, like it sort of mentioned a couple things in passing that then never came up again that I definitely had more questions about, but it's also possible that those rose to prominence after he wrote this book, so that's more of an issue of being outdated than anything. If you want another book that talks about these kinds of things, Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity by Steve Silberman talks a lot about various treatments and things done to autistic children throughout the course of history. I remember it being fantastic, but also really messing with my head for a while, and since this video is already taking a lot of emotional energy for me, I could not quite bring myself to go back through it and try to find more things I may have missed for this video. Based on my research, it would probably just be a handful of anecdotes to add to this, nothing massive, and that was just not a risk-benefit that I could justify for at least this moment in my life, because self-care is important and we love to see it. So this video is not going to be an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's many more cures out there that I'm not going to cover, but these seem to be the major big ones. I've also made the decision, I'm sorry, there's so many So many caveats. We're almost done with the caveats. I've made the decision to exclude the names of all of the children involved in various cures and stories and whatnot. I feel uncomfortable with how much these people have been used as political pawns and representations of something rather than as entirely human people, and I do not want to inadvertently further that, so my continuous use of this child may sound vague. I do have all of their names in my notes, and I've made the deliberate choice to exclude them here. That was deliberate. All right, we're jumping in. So, for brief historical context, the first time autism was medically described was in 1925 by Grunya Efimovna Sukareva, a Jewish Soviet child psychiatrist. And the word autism itself appeared in 1908 from Swiss psychiatrist Paul Eugen Bleuler, who used it to describe a particular set of traits, being socially withdrawn and self-focused and seemingly disconnected from reality in his patients with schizophrenia. Sukareva then used that term to describe some of her patients with childhood schizophrenia until she started to wonder if perhaps it was maybe a separate disorder, so she described that in both a 1925 and a 1926 paper. That 1926 paper was published in German and thus most likely read and sourced, but not cited, by Hans Asperger in the 1940s when he was publishing his writings about autism. Asperger also worked with Jewish doctors George Frankl and Annie Weiss at that clinic who were writing about this phenomenon, though they never used the word autism. And those two doctors would escape to the US, where Frankl would work with Leo Kanner, and they would both publish about autistic traits, though Kanner would be the only one to use the word autism and thus is primarily given the credit for the discovery. Leo Kanner also most likely took from Asperger's work, though I'm a bit less mad about that academic dishonesty there because he was an Austrian-Hungarian Jew and worked closely with people who knew Asperger and may have had petty reasons for not wanting to give him any credit. Anyway, all of which to say, autism is just over 100 years old as a concept and did not become a distinct diagnosis from schizophrenia in the DSM until 1980. And Asperger's syndrome was only in the DSM from 1994 to 2013. So when it comes to sorting what potential treatment could look like, there has not been a huge runway of time there. Kanner's first ever case, Donald Triplett, died in June of 2023. Like, this history is very, very recent. Now, the first idea for a cure that I think we're all pretty familiar with at this point is the idea of the refrigerator mother, which was first introduced by Kanner and then popularized by a psychologist named Bruno Bettelheim in the 1950s. And the idea is that the reason autistic children were autistic is due to the lack of parental warmth, particularly from their mothers, and the solution was to do what was literally called a parentectomy, which would remove the autistic children from their cold and uncaring homes and put them in special schools that focused on a nurturing environment. And he claimed that he had successfully treated dozens of children via this method. One of the main effects of this theory on parents was often removing parents from decision-making regarding their children's healthcare and otherwise well-being, denying them social supports, and sometimes involving child protective services and doing investigations on parents for their behavior when it was just the fact that their child was autistic. This theory was first contradicted in 1964 by a Dr. Bernard Rimland in his book Infantile Autism, the Syndrome and its Implications for a Neural Theory of Behavior, where he suggested that Bettelheim's theory was illogical and autism was likely more genetic and otherwise internally caused than environmental. Since the refrigerator parent theory obviously caused a lot of shame and self-hatred for parents, this new idea of what might actually cause autism resonated with a lot of parents and gained traction quickly. He also created the Autism Society of America, which is a parent advocacy organization. Also, fun fact, Dr. Rimland consulted on the film Rain Man, and Dustin Hoffman interviewed his autistic son in preparation to play the character. Rimland did become an anti-vaxxer and openly supported the vast majority of the so-called cures that we're going to be talking about today, so there is that, but we can appreciate his initial contribution to, and at the very least, overturning the refrigerator mother theory. So thanks for that. Thanks for absolutely nothing else. The next so-called cure is the adventure of facilitated communication, which it is very important that I clarify. We are differentiating facilitated communication from AAC, which is augmentative and alternative communication. Also, brief side note, I think it's really interesting that FC was largely seen as a cure because the majority of these other cures are seen as such because they change behavior. And like, yes, having the ability to communicate can change behavior and usually calm it down to some extent because it gives other avenues for expressing needs and feelings. But I have never seen that phenomenon cited regarding facilitated communication, which is just interesting to me that this is considered a cure in comparison to everything else in this list, I guess. But basically, in 1990, a professor of special education at Syracuse University named Douglas Bicklin brought the idea of facilitated communication to the US and established the Facilitated Communication Institute at the university. The idea is that facilitators guide the child's hands over a keyboard so that they can spell out what they want to say, giving them the ability to communicate in words in a way that they've never had access to before. There's also a different version of this where the facilitator will hold up the board and then sometimes move the board around with added prompting to the speller. It's all more or less the same idea. Bicklin then marketed this miraculous breakthrough grew on ABC's Primetime Live, ended up on the CBS Evening News, and he trained thousands of facilitators all over the country. And to this point, the book lost me a little bit because its initial discussion of the questions around facilitated communication were focused a bit on this level of communication and intelligence are not something people with this level of disability are capable of side of it, which in an age of presumed competence was a bit of a difficult read. But there is nuance here, however. When people learn to use independent alternative communication options without outside facilitators, particularly when they have no prior experience of speech or otherwise linguistic communication, they do tend to follow a typical trajectory of linguistic growth as they learn how to use the device or the letterboard and express themselves via language. So when these children, in their first ever time working with a letterboard and a facilitator, are saying overly poetic things about the nature of life and God and communication itself, as well as things about their lived experience with their disability that are inherently political, that does start to raise some questions. Many of the common examples cited as being from facilitated communication are variations on autism is holding me hostage and I want to get out. That sentiment seems to repeatedly appear. And parents also started to raise questions around why their children were only using the letterboard with their facilitators and actively refusing to use it with their parents. The fact that these students could type so much without spelling or grammatical errors, and then they would sometimes see the facilitator say the child was typing when the child was not even looking at the board. Things ended up coming to a head in 1994 when a bunch of cases had been logged, children accusing their parents, siblings, and caregivers of assault. And while this, to a small degree, was actually to be expected in that disabled people are much more likely to experience assault than the general population, cases were coming up all over the country and children were being removed from homes. And one district attorney, in order to prosecute the family who'd been accused, realized that he would have to prove that the accusations came from the child and not from the facilitator. So he asked Howard Shane, a communication expert at Boston Children's, to help create a study that psychologist Douglas Wheeler could use to test this fact. And basically the way that this worked was that a table would be split in half and the facilitator and the child couldn't see each other's sides, but they would share like a letterboard. So they would have the team spell out the objects that they saw on their side of the table, but sometimes the child would be shown something that was different from what the facilitator was shown. And in not a single trial did they get a response from the child that overrided their facilitator. A dozen studies were conducted across 3 different countries with 180 trials overall, and they all came up with the exact same results. Bicklund's response was basically that testing this method puts undue stress on the child and thus doesn't reflect typical communication, so the data doesn't count and anybody can plainly see that this thing is working, it's just not testable, which is sure an argument that he could totally be using. Facilitated communication is currently widely marketed as the rapid prompting method or spelling to communicate. They're both a tiny bit different from the traditional method, but they equally do not hold up to any scientific or academic standards. ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, has issued statements warning practitioners and parents against these methods as they waste time, money, and energy on unproven methods that could be better spent on learning and utilizing independent communication methods. FC can still be a bit contentious in the community among autistics because some people feel that any debunking of facilitated communication is therefore saying that non-speaking disabled people are unable to communicate and speak for themselves. One particular piece of contention is whenever like a book or a documentary comes out that centers an autistic supposedly from their point of view, but uses a version of facilitated communication, and then there are lots of arguments about not believing autistics capable of telling their own stories and how every time a non-speaking autistic appears in media, which is very rare, we criticize it and lateral ableism and all of those things. And I think that we can acknowledge, right, that like, yes, a lot of the I don't believe they can do that on their own comes from an ableist place and is bad and wrong. And also in certain cases, it can be less of, I don't think they're capable of that, and more of, I don't think that's coming from them in their own voice because this method of communication does not hold up to any statistical standards, and I worry this media is actually just the story non-disableds want to hear from disabled people rather than the story this person wants to tell and is low-key taking advantage of them. Those two things can kind of coexist. If that language was coming from them via any form of independent AAC, I would entirely believe that it did come from them. It's just that it doesn't, and that raises a lot of questions, particularly when it comes to media where there is significant money to be made, not just from sales of the media itself, but also from the promotion of their facilitated communication method via that media and subsequent publicity. There is direct conflict of interest, I guess is what I'm going to say, there for that situation. This one in particular is also one of those things where you really need to check your biases and be careful where you tread with this conversation. But at the end of the day, there are great AAC options that allow for independent communication and are incredibly evidence-based and speech-language pathologist approved and not always covered by insurance, but are more likely to be than FC ever is. That should be the standard of care because communication is important. That is the one piece that Bicklund totally had correct. Communication is a human right and it should be treated as such, which I would argue facilitated communication does not treat it as such. The next cure to come along is secretin in 1996. This is a hormone that regulates stomach, liver, and pancreas secretions, hence the name secretin. secretin. And after Victoria Beck's autistic son, who had severe intestinal issues, had an endoscopy which involved a dose of secretin, she discovered that 10 days after this dose, he seemed to be doing a great deal better, particularly with speech and showing more engagement in things. And she then found the same situation in 2 other children, so all 3 cases were published as a case study of sorts. This then led to secretin quickly becoming seen as a miracle cure of sorts, but since it was only made by one company, it became very hard to come by, which led to a lot of price gouging and a lot of fraud. And adjusting for inflation to what costs would look like today, a genuine dose of secretin would cost up to $17,000 a year. A biochemist in Massachusetts wanted to help this issue of scarcity, but in order to do that, he kind of needed FDA approval, which led to empirical studies that found that in 1999, both children on the secretin side and the placebo side showed large amounts of improvement over the course of the study, which was then followed by 15 more studies over the course of the next 3 years. Not one of them would show any effectiveness of the drug at all whatsoever. It seems that this therapy in particular has more or less died out since then, I would assume due to the sheer expense and logistics of it in comparison to some of the other popular therapies, but it is still talked about a good deal. After this, we have the vaccine disaster, which began in 1998 and continues to wreak havoc to this day. I'm not going to cover it that much here because I already have an extensive video about it that I will link above that you should totally check out. But there are some things I learned from this book that I did want to add here. So you're welcome to go pause this one and go watch that one and then come back if you want. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here. The very short TLDR version is that in 1998, a British, no longer gastroenterologist named Andrew Wakefield decided to publish a paper where he said that he discovered a new intestinal condition specific to autism that is the cause of autism, and that gastrointestinal condition seems to be caused by the measles virus, and that said virus can come from environmental exposure or from the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccination, which he told everybody via press conference, so that immediately set off a massive crisis where people stopped vaccinating their children, causing measles outbreaks that killed several people, and scientists were immediately trying to prove him wrong on that from like day one. He'd also gotten a lot of trouble a few years before this for implying that the measles virus was what caused the decreased blood flow to the intestine known as Crohn's disease, which he retracted and was like, yes, the scientific method, you live, you learn. But this time he really just doubled down on it like a lot of times. And then a few other scientists came forward with seemingly supporting research about the measles thing, and journalists were like, we have to play both sides of this debate. It's not a debate, but they felt like they had to play both sides to it. So then they were putting pseudoscience and actual science against each other in the media, which was not the move, and added a lot more fuel to the fire. There was then a congressional hearing that in reality went super badly for the anti-vaccination contingent, but the media acted like it was an even back and forth. If not only published the anti-vaccination side of it sometimes, really depends on which media outlet you're talking about. And then 6 years after the publication of Wakefield's paper, journalist Brian Deer published an article talking about how Wakefield's research did not have any approval by an ethics board, which he was doing like endoscopies and spinal taps on children. This is not low-risk stuff he was doing. That he was paid $100,000 by an attorney named Richard Barr, who was representing a bunch of clients trying to sue for damages about the MMR vaccine causing autism in their kids. And at least 5 of the 8 children in a study were Barr's clients, implying that the data were super cherry-picked. And then later came out, also via Brian Deer, because he's a legend, that Barr had acquired $30 million from the UK's Legal Services Commission, and $20 million of that went directly to his firm. $800,000 of that went to Wakefield, who also held a patent for a new measles vaccine and had started 2 separate companies which he intended to use to sell that vaccine and market testing kits for his new gastrointestinal disorder. Over $1 million went to the company that had done most of the testing backing up that measles idea, which had already been completely disproven as the lab was unaccredited and all of their data were inconclusive or likely false positives due to persistent sample contamination. And most of the other doctors and scientists who had come out in support of Wakefield had also received anywhere from $30,000 to $800,000 each. Also, Richard Barr's scientific investigation committee was mostly made up of lawyers. Not a single member had led a research team or done a postgraduate degree in any of the relevant topics, and Barr asked for another $20 million from the commission after this, which was denied, and he ended up dropping the case. Also, Wakefield's research was incredibly non-replicable. I feel like that's sort of implied here by the level of conflict of interest that's going on. They also got one of his research assistants to testify at the 2007 Omnibus Autism proceedings, where he literally admitted to Wakefield fudging data and felt so uncomfortable with it that he asked his name be removed from the paper, which is just really good on that particular research assistant. The late 90s had another vaccination mess, however, with the thimerosal scare. This is also the TLDR version of this. This is also covered in the vaccination video. Basically, it came to light via some legislation about making known how much mercury people were consuming for fish pollutant reasons, that many vaccines contained thimerosal, which is a harmless mercury-based preservative that's a completely different chemical compound than the mercury that you're thinking of, and it exists in vaccines that have multiple doses per vial to prevent bacteria contamination. A pediatrician named Dr. Neil Halsey, after after being in a meeting with the FDA about this, sort of freaked out about how they couldn't be like 150% sure that it was harmless. And so with 1 week left as the head of the American Academy of Pediatrics Vaccination Advisory Committee, he felt like he had to put in some precautions and do it really, really quickly. There were a lot of extenuating circumstances during this week that led to most board meetings being held over teleconference rather than in person. And so though most everybody else believed that like, yeah, maybe we should do something about that at some point, but like it's definitely fine, because like it's such an unbelievably micro dose that it's statistically not doing anything harmful, and we know now that it's not doing anything harmful. Halsey pushed the AAP to make a recommendation on, for precaution's sake, not giving certain thimerosal-containing vaccinations to children for the time being, threatening to make his own press release if they didn't do that. So a statement was very begrudgingly released in July of 1999 that was notably incredibly confusingly worded because nobody really agreed on what the recommendations should be, which created a lot more unnecessary confusion and anxiety in the general population. Thimerosal was pulled from vaccinations by 2001, which, if it had been linked to autism, would have led autism numbers to decrease, and instead they continue to increase and were consistently the highest that they've ever been. I think it's important to once again point out that Asperger's syndrome appeared in the ICD in 1992 and the DSM in 1994, meaning that people with more mild traits of autism were suddenly getting diagnosed, adding to the rates, and as more people are learning about it and meeting autistic people, rates are inevitably going to increase for some time anyway, and they continue to do so. At the time of this book's publication, autism was 1 in 150 children, and I believe it's now 1 in 33 at this point. And that does not mean that there are more autistic people than ever before. It means there's more people who are having their autism detected than ever before. In 2007 was the Omnibus Autism Proceedings, which is basically them, this is also in the vaccination video, which is basically them putting forth one case to be tried in the US Court of Federal Claims that would then sort of be the poster child for all of the other claims filed by vaccines supposedly causing autism. This chapter in particular is my favorite part of this book because the way that it was written was so incredibly satisfying. Basically, most of the people on the plaintiff's side were professionals at testifying in court about autism and vaccines, and if they'd ever done patient care, had not done it in 15 or more years. Most of them not even with autistic patients. Most of them also did not know enough about the topic to survive cross-examination. Meanwhile, the defense side brought out the world's leading expert on autism to show, via home movies of the girl central to the trial, that she had been showing autistic traits well before her MMR vaccination. Brought the world expert on PCR tests to pull apart the way all of the studies central to the arguments of the plaintiff side were structured and run because they were all bad. And then Wakefield's research assistant to say that Wakefield had falsified data, which all of those studies that they just debunked were the ones that were the basis of the arguments of the plaintiff's side. And this should have marked the end of the vaccine disaster, but obviously it is not. Parents continuously are choosing to put their children at risk of serious illness rather than vaccinating them because they're afraid of their children developing autism, despite there being literally no actual research to back that statement up. The Mercury idea also continues to wreak havoc in other directions in the how do we cure autism world as well. For example, in 2000, two moms, nurse practitioner Lynn Redwood and businesswoman Sally Bernard, published a paper in a very small and not peer-reviewed journal that basically said that mercury from thimerosal had to have caused their kids autism because the symptoms of mercury poisoning are the same as autistic traits. For the record, that's not true. And they concluded that if the mercury caused the autism, the removal of excess mercury must cure it. And so they suggested the use of chelation therapy, something typically used for heavy metal poisoning. And chelation therapy involves the administration of chemicals designed to bind to mercury and to eliminate it from the body, which can be intravenous or via pill. If you get the illegal non-FDA approved options, there's also nasal sprays, suppositories, liquid drops, and clay baths. And also like lotions or something like that. Obviously don't do that. Bad. Anyway, chelation was tested by father and son David and Mark Geyer. Mark has a background in medicine and his son David in biology, and they found results that were technically statistically significant regarding its effectiveness, but also close enough to being chance that we cannot put approximately any stake into it. And statistically, they also fudged data somewhere just given the otherwise track record of autism cure research we've seen thus far. A wealthy parent of an autistic kid in California who claimed that the chelation was curing his son after rubbing a chemical on his legs and forearms daily, costing them over $5,000 a year, which adjusted for inflation is just over $8,000 a year, decided to launch an organization called Generation Rescue, a nonprofit for parents of mercury-poisoned children, in 2005. This organization recruits rescue angels who then go out into the universe to spread information about the wonders of chelation therapy, which it feels culty. Now for the record, chelation therapy can have serious side effects in potentially taking minerals out of the body that kind of need to be in there. Chelation can cause headache, muscle pain, nausea, seizures, high or low blood pressure, osteoporosis, kidney damage, heart failure, and respiratory failure. This method is still pretty common, unfortunately, even after a child died in 2005 because his calcium levels dropped too low, and he was the third child to die from that specific type of intravenous chelation therapy since 2003. Unfortunately, the Geyers were also not done with suggesting so-called autism cures, and the next one would be a lot worse. You see, there used to be this theory called the extreme male brain theory of autism that has since been debunked, basically suggesting that men and women have fundamentally different brains as is related to the amount of testosterone that they have in their bodies, and autistic people are on the extreme end of that. There's no such thing as the male and female brain. I have a video about that. I will link it above. Now, the Geyer's solution to this problem was, of course, to lower autistic testosterone levels by chemically castrating them using Lupron, which is primarily used to treat symptoms of prostate cancer, but also sometimes used to delay precocious puberty. It's also sometimes used to chemically castrate sex offenders in certain jurisdictions, and thus obviously has huge side effects regarding fertility, meaning that this cure doubles as a eugenics measure. Great! And I'm being so sarcastic. This is how I'm coping. I'm sorry if it comes off a little. Anyway, it can also cause other acute and lifelong health risks, and in their 2006 paper on Lupron, in which it should be noted the Geyers always used the brand name rather than the generic Leuprolide, they suggested that lowering testosterone via this medication also lowers mercury levels at the same time. They have filed for 2 patents on this treatment, and they charge in the tens of thousands for tests and medication. The organization Defeat Autism Now believes that autism is caused by brain toxins entering the body via a leaky gut, and that this can be fixed using the 5 R's of gut restoration, which are remove, replace, repair, reinoculate, and rebalance. Basically, after you spend an exorbitant amount of money on tons of medical testing, you remove lots of things from the diet and sometimes take things to clear toxins from your body. You replace digestive secretions by taking lots of enzymes and acids. You reinoculate the gut by taking lots of probiotics and supplements, and then you repair it by taking lots of vitamins, all of which conveniently require buying a lot of often not FDA-approved things. Wild how that keeps popping up here. Also, researching this one in particular completely messed with my advertisements algorithm, and so now anytime I open any website, they just want me to buy supplements. There's also your standard steroids, cod liver oil, cranial manipulation, sonar depuration, which is high intensity sound waves, RNA drops, not how RNA works, the body ecology diet, which is primarily fermented foods, vitamin B6 injections, which can damage nerves, increased vitamin A, which can damage the liver. Others recommend camel's milk, foot soaking machines, laser therapy, bacteria containing nasal sprays, pig whipworm eggs, and baths in magnetic clay. And for parents willing to travel to Mexico, Costa Rica, or China, the promise of stem cell transplantation awaits. And there's also the traditional gluten-free and casein-free diets that are based on a debunked 1980s Norwegian study. These can sometimes appear to work because IBS is a really common comorbidity with autism. You'll notice a lot of these cures talk about gut issues. There is a correlation there, kind of. And lactose in particular is a very high FODMAP carbohydrate, which can lead to issues for those with sensitive guts. That does not mean that you're curing autism. It means you're pointing out that they have IBS and you're helping to eliminate stomach pain. And also, that's not universal by any means. It might change behavior if they're no longer in pain all the time. They're probably going to be a lot chiller, but still, that's not curing the autism. Specific diets like this should only be implemented when there is medical reason to do so, because we do need all of the nutrients for specific reasons, and diets that eliminate huge food groups can cause issues such as calcium and vitamin D deficiencies, which can lead to osteoporosis. Also, being gluten-free can make you miserable because gluten kind of regulates your serotonin. I know that from experience. So don't go on special diets if you don't need to do that, is the message of this section. Speaking of things that you shouldn't put in your body while we're here, one of the more horrifying cures is MMS, which stands for Miracle Mineral Solution. MMS was created by a Scientologist in 2006 and supposedly works by clearing the body of mysterious parasites and other pathogens that cause autism. It is claimed to cure autism, malaria, diabetes, cancer, Ebola, and AIDS. Also, it's bleach, which can be ingested via mouth or via enema. What I was most surprised by, beyond the horror of literally all of that, this section is short for a reason, was how many people seem to genuinely, in full honesty, be using MMR without having died yet. Like, to be clear, it's killed a lot of people, but I was honestly more surprised by how many people it hasn't killed. This one in particular just really absolutely breaks my heart, so we're gonna move right along to another so-called therapy that is also incredibly common, which is hyperbaric oxygen therapy, something that is approved solely for conditions relating to bodies needing more oxygen, such as carbon monoxide poisoning and diver decompression. Risks of this include mild effects such as ear pressure or sinus pain, all the way to very serious adverse effects such as paralysis and embolisms. It's also incredibly expensive and a huge fire risk. A small child died as a result of a hyperbaric oxygen chamber exploding in February of this year, unfortunately. There's also a recent medication cure called Leucovorin that appeared in February of this year. It is a medication that protects red blood cells while someone is undergoing chemotherapy. It has side effects such as fatigue, alopecia, dangerously low levels of a type of white blood cell, potential seizures. Apparently a 3-year-old said his first words a few days after taking this medication, but like, you kind of know the drill at this point. I should also mention shock therapy and ABA while we're here as well. I've done a more thorough video on ABA that I tried to keep as nuanced as humanly possible. I will link that above that you could watch. ABA is very complicated, it's very nuanced, and typically focuses more on modifying external behavior rather than addressing the root causes of the issue or being aware of what's actually a problem versus what society might deem to be a problem. And up until the late 1980s was very aversive heavy, which we know is less effective when it comes to learning things, not to mention unethical. The first ideas of ABA appeared in 1913. It was built upon by B.F. Skinner in the 40s, and then in the mid to late 60s, a guy named Ole Ivar Lovaas, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, incorporated electric shock into his version of it, which, not to like super defend this guy because he did say and do a lot of really ableist stuff, he did only use this for the purpose of preventing and stopping self-injury, and he abandoned these ideas by 1990 because he realized the results were only temporary. Also, he should have abandoned it because it was unethical, but I really only found a source of him talking about it being ineffective. ABA is and has been ever evolving, and a lot of the stuff that is more effective for people and marketed as ABA is actually occupational therapy and speech language therapy that is only covered by insurance if advertised as ABA. So again, super complicated. We're not going to get into the weeds of that here today. What I will mention is a guy named Matthew Israel, the guy who created the Judge Rotenberg Educational Center in Canton, Massachusetts, that is more or less the only place to use electric shock on disabled people at this point. It opened in 1971 in Providence, Rhode Island, and then later moved to Canton, and has been in hot water regarding its use of physical punishment basically since the beginning. Massachusetts officials have twice tried to shut the Rotenberg Center down, once in the 1980s and again in the 1990s. Both times parents rallied to its defense, and both times it prevailed in court. He had a second school in California that opened in 1977. 2 years later, the LA Times reported on abuse there, and 2 years later, a student died while being strapped face down to a bed, and a 64-page social services complaint in 1982 led to that facility no longer using physical punishment. But that did not change matters on the East Coast, where at least 2 other students have died. Matthew began using electric shocks in 1988, suggesting that they would increase the consistency of the aversive, since every teacher hits children at different strengths, and that the previous aversive options were putting the teachers at risk because they were getting hurt when trying to hurt their students. In 2014, the FDA recommended a ban on these devices that became a ruling in 2020, only to be overturned by the Court of Appeals just over a year later because the ban supposedly got in the way of doctors working with that school's ability to practice medicine. And yes, this is still going on, and at least as of 2007, Matthew Israel has a salary of $400,000 a year. So that's just fantastic. When it comes to the why do all of these so-called cures latch on so hard, Dr. Offit quoted a British physician named Michael Fitzpatrick, who is also the father to an autistic son, that I think sums it up fairly well. Parents are liable to believe in alternative treatments for autism for a number of reasons. First, the behavior of autistic children may fluctuate for no apparent reason. Second, there is a tendency for behavior to improve over time, particularly in the age range of 6 to 10, after a more difficult period between 2 and 5. Third, it is difficult to isolate the effect of any particular treatment from other factors that may influence behavior. A child may improve for a range of reasons not connected to the treatment. But when you have invested money, time, energy, and above all, hope in a particular treatment, it is natural to want to attribute any improvement to that treatment. I also completely see the energy behind parents feeling let down or left behind or wanting somebody responsible for funding the care of their child. It is no secret that we have really bad healthcare options in this country and that specialized care is really expensive and that we have very little social and financial supports available for families in need. This undercurrent anger of like, I want to sue who's responsible so I can get the money to fund taking care of my child is one that just continuously stuck out to me because that is a level of anger that usually ends up in the far right politically, but the desires of that anger actually better align with what the left is trying to do regarding like farther left, like the stuff that is deemed as socialism, like universal healthcare and stuff like that, is what they actually really want, which I just find particularly interesting and poignant. There's also, and I talked about this in my vaccination video, a serious issue with how we communicate science to the general public, which I do think is a lesson that was learned primarily because of the autism and vaccines crisis. Basically, because of how research works, you can't say this does not cause this because you cannot prove that in 100,000% of the cases, it's not going to cause that. But what you can prove is that you found no evidence that this thing caused this. But by saying publicly, there's no evidence to date that this thing causes this, it sounds like you're timid or like you're saying, well, there might be evidence, we just haven't found it yet, so be careful and cautious anyway, which is usually not what they're actually trying to say. People also often generally don't understand the scientific method. We saw this a lot during the early stages of the pandemic, where people assumed that because the data and recommendations were changing as we learned new things about COVID, it meant that science didn't know anything, when science is actually a very fluid discipline that is always and ever changing. But because many people don't know this, they inherently don't trust it because they think that science should be solid and concrete, when they should trust it because this is actually how the field works. And I'm going to primarily blame the education system for this, but I also think that science could definitely work a little bit harder on the PR angle and assume that people don't know this stuff. Frankly, even people who do know this forget it when they're stressed about something, so there needs to be more care in how we directly communicate things. But then, when you combine that with journalistic interest and the 24/7 news cycle where everybody's trying to get clicks in order to make money, publishing a shocking story with little to no data behind it is infinitely more profitable than publishing a retraction or well-researched follow-up. It also takes a great deal of time for follow-up replication studies to happen. The scientific process is not a notoriously quick one, so if somebody publishes the story based on one study, they may not have debunking evidence for that story for quite some time afterwards. And there's an instinct to jump on every new discovery immediately to be the one to profit off of it, even if it still technically remains unproven because it has not yet been replicated. But at its core, the parents will do anything to protect their children thing is both an incredible strength and an incredible place to take advantage of people. It is deeply unsurprising to me how often we see these fraud autism cures connect to fringe religious groups, because a lot of this does operate a bit like a cult. This doctor is speaking the real truth. He's the only one who gets this. He's the only one who's brave enough to stand up for the little guy. I need to give him all my money and all my attention because he's the one who's going to cure my child, which further incentivizes these people to commit fraud because they're getting very rich off of it, as well as adoring praise. And many of them do seem to genuinely believe that they're helping an underserved group when really they're just taking advantage of them. And beyond that, most religious cult leaders base their origin stories on how they were able to cure some disabled person. All of those televangelist, I will say this prayer over your body and the cancer will disappear things that we to some degree know are fraudulent, but maybe a small piece of us wants to believe is possible, function identically. People believe this so strongly because they want to, and the more time and energy and money they spend on these things, the more that they want to believe that it was worth it, because the sunk cost fallacy is a very strong one. I should also note that this particular idea is not new. Disabled children die every year and exorcisms performed on them to try to get the disability out in the same way that they did hundreds of years ago when parents were trying to get rid of their changeling child and get back what they believed to be their real one. And I think the recent increase in an individualist politics, the sort of every man for himself, don't trust the establishment view of the world, has really increased the popularity of alternative medicines and otherwise looking for the people telling the real truth. And I'm not just referring to the alt-right side of things, because a lot of this rhetoric appears on the other side as well. I would be remiss if I ended this video without talking even remotely about the actual realities of curing autism. Offit's book does a great job of painting the picture of how incredibly complicated it would logistically be, given that there are so many different presentations of autism, that there are so many different aspects of day-to-day life that are impacted by it. And you may notice each one of these so-called cures sort of tackled a different group of traits. Like facilitated communication was seen as much of a cure as secretin did, which was as much as shock therapy, even though all of these were focused on completely different aspects of autism. Offit also noticed that this level of complication carries over to the genetics of autism as well. We have some idea about what genes might be affected, but there's a lot of them and they're not consistent across all autistics either, which puts that even more into question. And even if we did isolate a single gene, there are many other chronic things caused by a singular gene like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis that we have not been able to cure either. I also more generally feel a bit uncomfortable with the implication that autism is an illness rather than a core piece of how an entire human is built from the ground up. This isn't a cancer we can eradicate and keep the person unchanged underneath it. It's a whole lot more complicated than that. He paints all of this information as, but we know that these are the pitfalls, so there's hope because that's his first step. And I would argue that he actually just explained why a focus on a cure is kind of a fool's errand, and we should instead focus on ways to help accommodate the disabling aspects of autism and offer support to the people who need it rather than focusing on trying to prevent it in the future, because that's not going to be possible and is thus a terrible waste of time, energy, and money, which has been a bit of a theme throughout this video. And so I thought it was interesting that his book sort of ended on a note, well, these didn't work, but something else might, so let's keep trying. That sort of negated some of the primary message of it, or maybe that's just a vibe that I personally got, not what he actually meant by that. And also, the possibility of cure aside, there's also obviously massive ethical questions surrounding whether we should even try looking for it in the first place, because eugenics. I think there is a difference between looking into it and doing something about it, but then if you look into it and find something and publish it, that could so easily become legislation enacting eugenics anyway, so I would feel uncomfortable knowing that said information was being acquired to begin with. And I think it's a bit of a hypothetical. I think the idea that everything is caused by genetics and genetics alone is in and of itself a fool's errand, but I'm not going to go on and on about that today. A lot of the anti-autism cure conversations tend to ignore the fact that some people would take the opportunity to cure it if given the option, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're full of internalized ableism either. It could just mean that they feel disabled to a degree that they would like it to go away, and there's no shame or fault in wanting that. And I don't think that it's fair to say all autistics don't even want the possibility of a cure, because that's fundamentally not the truth and not representing our entire population. These kind of discussions around disability eradication are incredibly complicated and nuanced and messy, and very much a can of worms that makes my head want to explode when I really start to think too hard about it. But I do think it's pretty fair to say that that's a scenario that statistically will not happen, which makes me less inclined to have an incredibly in-depth theoretical philosophical discussion about a thing that likely won't be a possibility, because that's time and energy that can be better spent elsewhere, like on developing ways to help people and making their disability feel less disabling to them where possible. Or to have these ethical conversations around disabilities that are starting to disappear, like Down syndrome being nearly eradicated in Iceland, for example, or the cochlear implant linguistic genocide debate. At the end of the day, we have lots of supports that we know are helpful in learning how to accommodate various needs for autistic people, something that will continue expanding, particularly as we see more and more people realizing that they're autistic and angling their life's work toward creating resources and research that are rooted in lived experience rather than people trying to build tools up for us from the outside. And I also feel that a lot of patient care is slowly moving towards like, okay, so how can we learn to work with what our body mind is trying to tell us instead of against it, which is always going to have better outcomes. I have less confidence in, say, the government figuring out how to better subsidize specialist care for disabled people. In fact, last I heard, they're allocating a bunch of money to re-research the link between autism and vaccinations that we've already proved a million times over is no link, which is just great. But my focus of late in finding and seeking out hope, at least, has been on community care, what that looks like, what can be achieved through that, and how we can all support each other as best we can. It's not going to fix the big problems, for sure, keep calling your representatives, but it's at least something. So if you clicked on this video looking for cures for your autistic loved one, first of all, hi, I don't know how you got this far without clicking off, but so glad to have you. I think the place that I want to leave this one is that acceptance and accommodation will inevitably be the better move in the long run. I know it feels like if you put all your time and energy in looking for a magical thing that's going to fix everything, it's going to be worth it, but that magical thing almost assuredly does not exist if you have not yet found it, and learning to accommodate the things that are disabling right now might get you to a point where you no longer need to be looking for that thing. Like for a different personal example, I grew up with debilitating migraines, and I spent years trying different medications and nothing was working, and I just felt like if I tried harder they would all go away. I also took like several vitamins and supplements every day that I was told would help, and I swear made zero difference. But after I was diagnosed as autistic, I started accommodating my sensory needs and learning tools to handle my emotional dysregulation, and then I found out that certain foods didn't make me feel great. Turns out I have really severe IBS and probably shouldn't eat a bunch of things, and now I get maybe 4 migraines a year, if even. And when I do, I can usually take medication for them because I no longer need to worry about spacing out how many doses of Tylenol and ibuprofen I'm taking because I don't take it as frequently. And am I cured of my migraines? Absolutely not. I could go out tomorrow and trigger one pretty easily if I really put in approximately no effort, but I put in that effort to change my lifestyle to accommodate them, and so now they're manageable because I started factoring it into things rather than just hoping it wouldn't happen. And obviously, there's a lot of nuance there, like, hey, get medical care, that's great, please do that. Alternative medicine and ignoring the medical establishment is not the answer, but if you've exhausted the options and are trying even more options that are getting more and more out there and less evidence-based, might be time to work in the acceptance and discomfort and working with the situation at hand instead of against it. Even if one day that magical cure comes along, maybe sometime in the future, well, by then you're going to have a better handle on how to listen to yourself and take care of your needs and economize your energy anyway, which is never a bad thing and literally cannot steer you wrong. So with that, thank you for sticking to the end of this slightly heavy video. I promise the next one's going to be an adventure. That's all that I know for sure. Please like, comment, subscribe, whatever if you so desire, but absolutely no pressure. I also have a Patreon linked below if you want to support me there and get early access to what I'm up to, but again, no pressure. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember that critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.